First of all, I'll just very briefly introduce myself. My name is Jim Mulvale. I'm at the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba, and also Vice Chair of the Basic Income Canada Network. I'm largely an academic administrator, but I maintain a faculty position at the University of Manitoba, and I have an ongoing interest in basic income going back many years in my own research. I'll be talking actually as a sort of panelist on the roundtable briefly about a proposal to move towards basic income that's recently come from the Canadian Association of Social Workers. But I also want to introduce our first speaker on the roundtable. Bruce Hyer is the Deputy Leader of the Green Party of Canada, and we're very pleased to have Bruce here today. Bruce was first elected as a Member of Parliament in 2006. He represents the riding of Thunder Bay, sorry, I forget the last part of your riding.
Superior North.
Thunder Bay, Superior North in the House of Commons. He was re-elected in 2008 and 2010. He initially sat as a member of the New Democratic Party, but sat as an independent for a while and recently joined the Green Party of Canada. Just in terms of his personal background, Bruce tells me he's got a very interesting background in forestry biology and also in entrepreneurship. He's a business person. In fact, he refers to himself, and I'm quoting here, as a lefty capitalist who likes to make a lot of money and spend it on worthwhile things. So without further ado, I'll welcome Bruce and ask him to make his remarks as part of our roundtable discussion.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me. BICN has been doing very important work for a long time, and I really commend you on your commitment to this cause. And we're on the same pathway here, and I think we're on an emerging pathway. I put my email address, which goes to my laptop, and nobody else here can bare your souls, and I won't share it with anybody without permission. Or I also brought 12 copies of roughly what I'm going to say here in the next 10 or 12 minutes, hopefully not 20 minutes, because I hope there's some time for interaction. For those of you who prefer a written copy, I'd be happy to give it to you. You deserve a lot of credit. You've been sticking to this issue for a very long time. And even when many people in politics or in the media discuss this as a pie-in-the-sky idealistic idea that's not really achievable, or even worse, as a dangerous socialist plot to undermine society, good for you. I've been reading, I've been writing and speaking about this for 44 years, about the need for some kind of basic annual income, or a universal basic income. And for example, just a couple months ago in Thunder Bay, in my riding, I helped to organize a community talk which got hundreds of people out for it, and a wide spectrum of society. It was quite a successful event, where Evelyn Forget, Dr. Evelyn Forget from the University of Manitoba came and talked about her really good research and work on going through the old archives for the MINCOM experiment in the early 70s in Dauphin, Manitoba. And she did a really good job of explaining how that worked very well. And son of a gun, people didn't just sit back and take the money. They used it to raise their kids better, to go back to school. It had very positive effects and virtually no negative effects. So we do have one experiment that has worked very well. So I don't need to explain to any of you the social and economic benefits of what we're here to talk about today. I think most of us may get into parsing some of the fine details, but I think we're pretty much on the same path. There are three big problems that I believe are facing Canada. I have two jobs. One is standing up for my constituents, and the other one is trying to formulate good policy and legislation in the House of Commons, or right now in the majority situation that we're in, try to stop the worst policies and platforms of the government. And those three huge problems are a large and growing income gap, that's what we're here to talk about, a large and growing climate disruption, which is threatening civilization and the future of most of the higher life forms on this planet due to CO2 from burning fossil fuels. I was the author of Bill C-311, the Climate Change Accountability Act. In the last Parliament, there were 707 private members' bills introduced. Only 4 of them made it through the House of Commons. Mine was one of them in a minority government. You may recall the Senate killed it. It's the only bill in the history of Canada killed in the Senate, but passed in the House with no debate, no consideration of any kind. There only have ever been 5 bills killed by the Senate ever. But the other 4, at least they agonized over it and had lots of committee work. This one was straight politics. The Prime Minister ordered his geriatric senators to kill the bill, and they did it in 1 hour. It was a very sad day for me. And then the last one, the last big problem we're facing is a democracy gap. I think most of us here know that we need some kind of proportional representation, but I'm not here to talk about that here today. Maybe another time or over a malt beverage later in the convention.
Good.
We've talked a lot in the breakout groups, and I've heard other people talk about how you're going to pay for this, and can you really do it top down? Well, sorry, I think we can do it at least partially top down, and I think I may have a way to pay for it, at least pay for a big chunk of it here today. So, but first let's talk about the income gap for a minute. My theory about money, you heard my quote. You gotta be careful what you say, it gets quoted back to you. I'm a lefty capitalist, a lefty businessman. And my theory about money is it's a lot like horse manure. And when it sits around in piles, it poses problems. You have to keep spreading it around. It's fertilizer. And over-fertilizing is just as bad as under-fertilizing. So with growing income gaps, we have a poor distribution of fertilizer problem that we need to address. I think that most of you want the same things that I want in our economy. I think you want a country that is clean and green and safe and prosperous and sustainable and reasonably equal in opportunity. And I believe the function of government is to do 3 things to foster fairness and inequality in social aspects like nutrition and healthcare and education. I want to read these to make sure I get it right. I want to serve in a government that does the following things: encourages the creative and the industrious and the generous, protects the weak, and controls the greedy and dangerous. So a large part of that is we really need, as you know, to set limits to poverty. I also think we need to set limits to greed. We need a floor. I also think we need a ceiling. I'm not going to talk about the ceiling part here today. When we get this done, the floor, then we can work on the ceiling. Everybody deserves to be warm, fed, and housed in our society. I don't think anybody here would argue about that. We all need to be protected and safe from bullies of all kinds. So we need to find a better way forward. In today's North American society, even the most hardened conservatives, or at least very few of them, would publicly anyway, deny basic food, shelter, and clothing to anybody. So I think we all know that we would benefit from a universal basic income. It's well known, it's pretty well documented, that the economic multiplier of injecting money at the bottom of the food chain has a lot larger economic benefit, especially regionally and locally, than making millionaires and billionaires and large multinational corporations richer. Back in 1970, when I was 23 years old and in my new job as senior environmental analyst for the state of Connecticut, it was a heady experience. I wrote an essay on a universal guaranteed income, as well as an upper limit on personal income, and I'd be happy to share it with you. When I got my first computer in 1983, I typed my physical manuscript into that first compact computer. It was called a compact, that weighed about 40 pounds. But I transferred it from computer to computer and over time. So if you write to me at that email address, I'll be happy to send it to you. And so for the last 40 years, I've been doing a regular rant, here again today, about the need for a basic income. And actually what I called it for most of that time was an adult annual living allowance. That was my term for it. And the two responses that I got from folks were the ones that we heard raised today in our big questions, big problems part of it. The first was, that's not fair, just giving it to some people. Well, it seems to me, and I think to you, the answer to that is simple. You just give it to everybody. You don't just give it to some people. You don't have a big bureaucracy to decide who's deserving of it. And also it makes it politically popular, whether you're rich or poor or in between, to get it. And the second response was, nice idea, but how are we going to pay for it? My intuitive feeling about this has been that we're already paying for poverty. I think you would understand and agree with that. We pay for it in many expensive and inefficient ways. And it's probably more expensive to pay for it in those ways: crime, prostitution, insurance, etc. So I'm not going to try and list all those ways we're paying for it. Now, a couple of years ago, I read with great interest a book called The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. How many of you have read that book? About half of you. I urge all of you to do what I've done. Get it, read it, lend it, buy extra copies, and give it away. It's real science about the adverse and very expensive effects to people by the wide gaps in income. A better title for that book, the title comes from Britain, and so it's not about metaphysics or religion, it's about gaps in income. But in Britain, a spirit level is a carpenter's level. It's got spirits inside of it, so Brits understand the metaphor. But here, I think one of the reasons it hasn't been a big seller particularly is the wrong title for a good book. I think the title should have been Why Trickle-Down Economics is Baloney, or something a little firmer than baloney. So I've always felt that we can't afford a basic universal income, and but I've been really at a loss for 4 decades as to how we're going to pay for it. So when people said, well, how are we going to pay for it? My intuitive sense was that we can afford it, but I didn't really have a lot of evidence. Well, I think I've stumbled upon the way to pay for it. And so my staff and I are currently working on legislation. We hope to introduce it this fall or this spring. We have a lottery in Ottawa for private members' bills. And when your number comes up, if you're lucky, you can introduce one bill. So my bill in the last House was the climate change bill, C-311. And that was a big one. And this one is, I think, a big one too. And so we hope to introduce it soon. And the basic structure is, the first part is, a fee is charged at the point of origin, comes out of the ground, or the point of import across the border on any greenhouse gas emitting energy source. So oil, natural gas, coal, based upon scientific data as to its likelihood to produce CO2. The second one is the fee is high, it's significant, it changes behavior, and it's progressively increased over time. And the third is that the fee goes into a trust fund and is returned straight to every citizen, every household, by the Canada Revenue Agency, equitably on an equal per capita basis, and in full. Not under my vision. It may not be where it ends up, but I would like to see none of it going to government, not a penny, except for the very tiny cost of administration. So in order to maximize effectiveness, the amount of the fee would be regulated over time. There would be a minimum, but it could get to be higher, based on the scientific assessments from both the economic science and the climate science, in order to balance the amount of the fee and the speed of the CO2 reductions. So why isn't it called a tax? Well, the first reason is tax is a 4-letter word, T-A-X-X. It's a dirty word, so if you're a politician, you don't want to say tax, especially if you're a member of the Conservatives, the Liberals, or the NDP. So the second is, it's not based upon price of the product, and it's not value added. Secondly, a third, it's rather based upon the amount of CO2. It's a scientific number, and it doesn't change as the price of oil and coal goes up or down. It'll stay the same or increase. And the last is, none of the revenue goes to government, and it's all returned to the citizens on a per capita basis, equal basis. So it's revenue neutral flow through. Well, does that sound like a tax to you? So, for example, if the average revenue collected at source was $1,000 a year or $10,000 a year per Canadian, then that's how much will be returned directly to every Canadian on an annual or quarterly, or when the fee gets to be more like $10,000, which is where I'd like to see it go, to be honest, in a decade. It's returned monthly to every Canadian by logical means. So if you live in a small house, ride a bicycle, if you're poor, or you're an energy conserver, you're going to make money on carbon fee and dividend. If you drive a Hummer and party hardy on oil and fly to Europe for weekends for fun, it's going to cost you a lot of money. There's no doubt about it. So I asked the question, can this get political support? Well, carbon fee and dividend is the main policy approach advocated by CCL, that's the Citizens Climate Lobby. How many of you know what the Citizens Climate Lobby is, or have you even heard of it? I urge you to go to their website, read about them, think about joining, think about sending them 25 bucks. This is a good idea. It's both in Canada and the US. The Citizen Climate Lobby argues that a carbon fee and dividend policy will be far easier to adopt and to adjust in more complicated mechanisms. I agree with them, thus enabling an economically sound transition that supports economic needs and the new energy economy is required. I think what needs to happen here is that the equal basic income people need to think about the carbon aspect of this, but the carbon people, the CCL, 5 minutes, it's a deal. The CCL needs to start pushing the basic annual income aspect of it. You need to bring these two streams together. James Hansen is director of NASA Institute for Space Studies. He was the first really super scientist who talked about the climate problems in a dramatic way. And he's also one of the people that helped to develop this idea. So, carbon fee and dividend is a market-based solution. And it means that politicians and bureaucrats in Ottawa will not get to choose, if we implement this, the energy companies that will flourish, not directly anyway, in the 21st century. The marketplace will pick the winners and losers. In comparison to regulation favored by the conservatives, who don't actually do it, but they talk about the need for regulation, which is really a tax. Or cap and trade, which the NDP has been talking about, and is expensive and hasn't worked in Europe, and it's complicated, and it makes carbon traders and bimmers just even richer than they are now. So even conservatives should like carbon fee and dividend. I joined the Green Party to serve as deputy leader for 3 reasons. The first is they have the best leader. They're the only party that allows me to represent my constituents and my conscience. And Elizabeth May and I already support the basic income concept that you're talking about. So I'd like to read to you from Vision Green, which is our policy on the web. You can Google Vision Green and read the entire 146 pages of it. Quote, "The Green Party of Canada believes it's time to revisit a major policy initiative, a guaranteed livable income, a GLI, for all. Its use could eliminate poverty and allow social services to concentrate on problems of mental health and addiction. The essential plan is to provide regular payments to every Canadian without regard to any needs test," close quote. So I want to thank you for your work, and when you leave this conference energized, I'm getting energized. I had an exciting morning. I thought it was just fantastic. You're a whole bunch of bright, engaged people who need to spread the word further. So I urge you to pick a party. No matter which party you pick, get involved. Yes, we need bottom-up, but we also need top-down. You know, a few hundred people getting engaged in any of the parties can influence policy and platforms. And so we don't have a very democratic candidate right now, I'm sorry, but we really don't, without a proportional representation system. And most MPs are trained seals, to put it bluntly, and that's what Pierre Trudeau actually called them, his own members. In 1970, he changed the Elections Act to put party names on the ballot, but in the fine print it said, you can only run for a party if the national leader signs your nomination papers. So most MPs, even though they may be bright and well-intended, are controlled by the three main parties. So get involved in whatever party you pick and help them to adopt these policies. Get out there and agitate and work and demonstrate for this. Be a little less nice than the average Canadian often is. Politicians move away from pain and towards pleasure. So offer them pleasure, but also cause them pain if they don't. You've got to cause them pain or they won't budge. And pain is spelled V-O-T-E-S. So you've got to get them worried about getting reelected. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. And I hope you write to me. I hope I get to talk to many of you individually as well as collectively today and tomorrow. I'm here for the rest of today, and I'm here for all of tomorrow. And you're doing a great job. Do it more, do it hard, do it energetically, and just remember that we politicians run your lives whether you like it or not. So cause us some pain, please. Thanks so much.
What I want to do, and I'm going to keep my remarks short because I think it's really important to get into the back and forth dialogue, Q&A part of the session, is just to briefly share some thoughts that have recently come out of the Canadian Association of Social Workers, with which I'm involved. This is actually a paper that was adopted by the board. It's not just a policy green discussion paper, but a formal position that was adopted by our board of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. It's from a paper called Promoting Equity for a Stronger Canada, the Future of Canadian Social Policy. And the Promoting Equity paper essentially talked about three kind of general areas. One was healthcare. One was the area of federal, provincial cooperation and coordination on social policy. And the third area was on income security. So it's really the third area on income security that I'm here to share some thoughts about today. Now, we've had lots of interesting discussion about, and Sheila mentioned it at the beginning, the notion of relentless incrementalism, the Canadian way of doing social policy for the most part, where we get to where we want to go step by step, stage at a time, being more pragmatic Canadians. But I think also occasionally we have a big bang in social policy in Canada. We introduced Medicare in the 1960s, but I mean even there was a whole, actually a whole 2 or 3 decades of local work on publicly provided health care and prairies and some other parts of Canada. So what I'm presenting here, I guess, it's I would call it a modest but ambitious proposal to, in a step-by-step way, get us towards from existing programs, from where we're at in terms of existing federal income security programs, to get us to a place in the hopefully short to medium-term future where we have resilient and coherent guaranteed income architecture here in Canada. Okay, now the paper kind of gives a thumbnail sketch of some of, this discussion about basic income in Canada certainly is not new. There's a thumbnail sketch of some of the basic income debates and proposals that have been brought forward in Canada, actually going back to the 1930s and the social credit government of Bible Bill Aberhart in Alberta, who had a version of what they called social credit. It was a form of guaranteed income. We had a bunch of government and policy think tank papers in the kind of late 60s, early 70s that talked about moving towards a term normally used in Canada has been guaranteed annual income. One significant one, of course, was by David Kroll, the Senate Committee on Poverty, proposed version of basic income in 1970. More recently on the political radar in Canada, we had, you know, and I think Rob Rayner and Kelly made this point earlier. It's a propitious time right now to be talking about basic income in Canada, because there has been politicians and even committees within government, not to mention groups like the Conference Board of Canada, which is not a socialist cell or a left-wing conspiracy. It's representing the business interests of Canada. Former chief economist of the TD Bank, I think, Don Drummond, and others have been talking about the need to have an intelligent, informed discussion about bringing in some form of guaranteed income in Canada. So it's a propitious time. So with all that in mind, is kind of the immediate or the sort of political context or background. The CASW proposal on guaranteed income talks about, we kind of look at this in practical and strategic terms. We were talking earlier about, you know, what's the elevator speech about basic income, or what's the bus ride conversation. We got a little bit more time to explain basic income to a skeptic. I mean, I think one, like maybe it's the bus ride speech, the bus ride conversation. When people say, oh, you know, guaranteed income, that's a crazy idea, it'll never work. Well, I think a response to that is to say, well, here in Canada, we already have forms of guaranteed income. I mean, when you look at existing programs at the federal level, and indeed some provincial programs too, at the federal level, the Canada Child Tax Benefit is a negative income tax mechanism that puts money in the bank accounts of families with young children. For seniors, the old age security system is our one remaining demo grant. It goes up to all seniors. Now it's taxable, and if you've got a good pension, you don't realize much of any of your OAS monthly payment if you're 65 or over. But it is set up as a demo grant, and of course, what's had a measurable effect, very good effect on lowering poverty rates among seniors is the negative income tax aspect of old age security, the guaranteed income supplement. So we have the Canada Child Tax Benefit, we have the GIS benefit for seniors, even for working age people. We do have forms of negative income tax-based guaranteed income in Canada. They're very modest. They don't put anything near a living wage in people's bank accounts. But we have the GAS HST rebate for low-income Canadians who are kind of older than kids and younger than seniors. And we also have the working income tax benefit, or WITB, which is the working poor to raise their income levels. So we have these little bits and pieces, these small aspects of modest levels of basic income, based on largely the negative income tax model. So what the CASW policy paper is proposing is that essentially we do three things. We look at raising the level of existing benefits. And we cite, for instance, the Caledon Institute of Social Policy proposal to raise the Canada Child Tax Benefit to $5,000 per child on an annual basis. And I mean, of course, what's happening with OAS, GIS, of course, this current federal government's, they're going in the wrong direction from our point of view. They're proposing that the OAS, GIS benefit be moved back to age 67 for people that will be hitting the senior threshold a few years down the road, which we think is exactly the wrong thing to do. But certainly reverse that, moving back to the age of eligibility, but look at increasing benefits there as well. And I mean, the big challenge is that working age group in the middle, you know, the people 18 to 65. And I mean, we've got the WITB, we've got the GST, HST rebate. There's other kind of minor programs that you're eligible for under the, you know, our very complicated income tax system. But I mean, of course, a notable spokesperson for the working age segment in recent years has been, well, now former Senator Hugh Segal, now at Massey College at the University of Toronto. And Senator Segal has spoken at many of these previous events that we've had, the Canadian talks about putting in place a comprehensive negative income tax-based guaranteed income program for working age people. And he argues, and I think with justice, that this could largely replace the existing provincial and territorial social assistance programs, which are the bottom rung, last resort measure that they're totally inadequate, hard to qualify for, vary from province to province. It's a real mess. And I think even people working in the system, many of them will admit this. So substitute this federal negative income tax-based mechanism for working age people. So what we're arguing is the Canadian Association of Social Workers is that by taking these little pieces, by increasing benefit levels, stitching them together, building up over time, we could come up with a coherent and resilient system of guaranteed income. Now, that's not to say medium to longer term. Maybe we want to be more ambitious, but I think given the political winds that we have to be pragmatic and strategic too. Now, I'll just conclude maybe just by talking very briefly about costs. It has been raised on a number of occasions already today. We pulled together some existing cost estimates of the program. I think maybe I should preface this by saying I think really careful and detailed costing of different models of basic income in Canada, that's work yet to be done, frankly. I think we need to prioritize that and work on it. But there has been some estimations of what this or that kind of version of it might cost. And these aren't, they're not back in the envelope calculations, although they do a lot more work in this area, I think. But just to give you a couple of figures, excuse me. Derry Com and Wayne Simpson, who are economists at the University of Manitoba, have costed out different versions, but they've estimated that a modest and targeted basic income program in Canada would cost roughly $38 billion a year. Senator Siegel in 2012 estimated that a comprehensive guaranteed income program in Canada would cost about $30 billion. So they're kind of in the same ballpark. This isn't the Democrat version. This is, but it's targeted. Excuse me. But it at least gives us figures as kind of reference points. Okay, I'll leave it at that. We'll get into more importantly, we talk about this, have some dialogue. Just to emphasize as the last point that federal leadership is absolutely crucial if we're going to be able to move in this direction in Canada. There's things provinces can do. Well, I'll put in a plug here. Sid Franklin and I are going